Hello everyone, we are going to start, and today we have Dr. Jonathan Rhodes from the School of Geography from UQ, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about when do social networks matter for setting conservation priorities. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rosia. Hi. Okay, so yes, I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing that is still sort of in progress, really, I guess, but we've got some sort of results that mean something, I hope. And so this is work that I've done with Eugene Chavez, who's here, Angela Guerrero, and Oyan Bowden. And it's really around looking at, so thinking about social networks and trying to understand when the network matters for conservation prioritization. So I guess I'll just introduce some of the things that we're interested in, and I guess two things I'm particularly interested in are what the value of new information about ecological and social processes for decision making. So this is really a sort of a monitoring question, and thinking about what's how important is information in decision making. And we're also interested in sort of social and ecological networks and how they drive conservation priorities. And I guess this work is really a sort of combination of the both, thinking about social networks and how they might drive conservation priorities, but also thinking about what is the value of knowing that information about the social network. And I guess I should warn you before I go on that this is a totally data-free presentation. So we've made everything up. So yeah, and it still doesn't work nicely quite. Anyway, just a warning. So if you're interested in data, then you can leave it out if you want. Okay, so I thought I'd just start quickly with, most of you probably are familiar with systematic conservation planning, but basically systematic conservation planning is really a structured approach for identifying conservation priorities and meeting defined objectives, and I guess it's sort of a bit broader than that, and this is just really to give you a bit of context. I guess sort of taking sort of frameworks from Knight and Pressey and Bottrell and others, and really it's around trying to define specific goals and data collection, identifying conservation priorities, so using tools to identify what those priorities are, and then having some sort of implementation strategy, and usually with stakeholder collaboration. But I guess I'm going to talk mostly today about sort of conservation prioritization, but I think some of the stuff we're talking about today has implications for implementation and stakeholder collaboration as well, but I'm particularly talking about conservation prioritization, which is really the idea of taking a particular objective, a specific objective, and then saying, well, what should we do, what actions should we take, where and when to meet that particular objective. And so this work is really about what's the influence of networks on those priorities, and the performance of those strategies, and how much information does understanding the network or knowing the network provide for you. So I guess we're going to go through a very quick, 2 slides of the history of conservation planning. So who knows, at least the one that's cited most, who knows when the first sort of systematic, iterative approach to systematic conservation planning was developed? Anyone know? That took into account complementarity between species.
1974.
Was it 1974? There might be. Mine dates a bit later than that. Basically, it was this guy, Jamie Kirkpatrick, in University of Tasmania, who basically, looking at I think vascular plants on the east coast of Tasmania, came to the conclusion that previous attempts for conservation planning were, I think this was 1983, I think, something like that, which were basically a scoring approach taking into account things like species richness and then scoring it. It wasn't right because as soon as you conserve one site, so this is really about reserve selection, as soon as you conserve one site, some species are already represented. When you go to the next site, the value of that next site changes because you've already represented some of the species. So we took into account complementarity and showed that actually you get very different priorities if you account for this. So this was really driven, he's an ecologist, and I guess he does some social stuff as well, but he's largely an ecologist. So it sort of started off with ecologists, and a lot of the conservation planning stuff has been driven by ecologists, but they started to think about economics, What about costs, those sorts of things, and incorporating costs? I'm just going to go through some of the things that they've tried to add to the prioritisation process. So Amy Ando did some stuff in the late 90s on costs and showed that if you incorporated costs, you could do much better. And then we started thinking about dynamic processes, dynamic decision-making processes. So this is where we take into account the dynamics of the system, and as is in reality in terms of conservation decision-making, usually decisions are not made at one point in time, they're made iteratively over time, and we might make decisions each year, or there might be a plan every 5 years. So it's an iterative process. So we started to think about those sorts of processes, and Costello and Polanski, I guess, one of the first to really show that in terms of using a dynamic programming approach to solve that prioritization process for reserve selection. And then started to think about multiple actions. I guess up to until sort of 10 years ago, it was mostly focused around reserve selection. We started thinking about multiple actions, interactions between actions, multiple actions, and dynamic processes, and so on. So I guess we've come a long way from just a pure ecological approach to one where we're starting to think about dynamics, economics, and how those drive those priorities. And so that's sort of where we are now-ish. And I guess at the moment there's a big drive or recognition that we need to think about social factors as well. And these social factors might be interactions between people, they might be institutions, and really this is driven by the fact that people have recognized that most conservation prioritizations never get implemented. And one of the arguments is that the reason why they don't get implemented is because we don't consider the social constraints and opportunities that drive the possibility to implement those. And so the argument is that we need to think of the social processes or the socio-ecological system so that we can understand where those opportunities for conservation arise and where the constraints arise as well. And so I guess recently there's a number of papers that have come out over the last few years trying to look at things like social values and ecological values and compare them. Some stuff on sort of opportunity in terms of willingness to sell. A couple of applications of sort of game theory, thinking about how decision makers respond to interventions in the system and so on. And I guess this is really about, I think this is two, I guess, approaches to thinking about social factors. One is thinking about if I'm going to implement strategies in a system, how do decision makers respond, and how does that affect the effectiveness of my decisions or my actions? And I guess there's another branch of that which is really sort of along the lines of actually using the social process and incorporating people within that process and understanding social behaviour in terms of the whole conservation planning process. So I guess the stuff we've been working on recently is really focusing on the former, which is if you're going to make a decision, how important is it to know how people will respond to that decision, given that their responses to those decisions are likely to determine the effectiveness of your actions. So that's really the point of view that we've been doing this work, rather than the integration of the social processes into the whole conservation planning process. Okay. So that's really, I guess, a bit of background. I guess some of you may know that already, but I think for those of you who didn't, I thought I'd cover that briefly. So now I'm going to think a bit. I'm going to simplify the whole system and think about sort of this monitoring or value of information type question. So to give you a bit of context, and then I'm going to talk about social networks, how those fit in, and what we've been doing. So if you think about, so largely conservation prioritization has been driven by ecologists. That's changing, and basically we can think of what we've been doing in this four box, and this is very simplified, and these are not black and white. In reality, there's different grades across these boxes, but I just wanted to display it this way to give you some context. So we can make decisions with no information. So we make bad decisions, but we can actually ignore the ecology or ignore biodiversity and ignore the social processes. And I guess what we have been doing largely through the development of systematic approaches to conservation is focusing, this way, where we've got the ecology in there, but we really haven't dealt with the social aspect so much. I guess at the same time, social scientists have sort of been doing this, and I guess less so in terms of implementing conservation prioritisation per se, in terms of the way I'm thinking about it. But certainly social scientists have been doing this. And I guess there's been a recognition that we sort of want to move up to here, where it's actually trying to characterise the whole socio-ecological system, and therefore we would make better decisions. Okay, so clearly this is your best situation, but we really want to recognise the socio-ecological system. And so we're going to move this way. But to get here costs money, time, a whole range of costs potentially. It may be hard to collaborate with social scientists. It may be hard to collaborate with ecologists. There are lots of barriers potentially to getting to here. So we need to think about the cost as well, and it may not be possible to get to here. And so actually, we don't think about cost in this stuff we've been doing, but I think this is where we'd like to go. It's thinking about the cost as well, but in terms of information about the social and ecological system. So let's assume we're here. This is your benefit. This is your conservation benefit. So let's assume we don't care about people. We care about biodiversity. But this benefit can be anything. And we can go from nothing, no information. We can make random choices or intuition. And we sort of want to get up to here. We're really characterising and using information on the whole socio-ecological system. And so we want to move from here to here. This costs money, time, sanity, I don't know, a whole range of things. So I'm not specifying what this cost is. And then we can either, let's simplify the problem and say we can either do the ecology first and then move to social, or we can do social first and move to incorporate the ecology. So if we do the first, which is sort of what we've been doing, which is dealing with the ecology first and then adding on the social components. If it looked a bit like this, where we've got a big benefit from the ecological aspects, we'd sort of have a guess that really this is probably the best thing to do first. We don't get much of a benefit from the social component. We get the biggest benefit from this. And so this might play out like this, so that if we incorporate people, we get a bit small benefit, and then we get a big benefit from the understanding the ecology. So in this case, we'd probably be most sensible to think about if we're going to invest resources, we'd probably invest a lot of resources first in understanding biodiversity, ecology, and then the social components, people would be of a lesser priority. And obviously, there's lots of grades in between here that we could also fit into. But possibly it's the other way around. Possibly considering people, it gives a much bigger benefit than considering the ecology. So we get a big benefit from understanding the social component, and we get a small benefit from adding on the ecological component. And then vice versa. If we did it the other way around, ecology gives us a small benefit, and the social component gives us a big benefit. So within thinking about this problem, I guess we don't really have any good ways of understanding which we should do. So if you started from a clean slate and you had a conservation problem where you wanted to prioritise actions, we don't really have good ways using some information that we have to say, right, we should invest most of our money in understanding the distribution of a species, or we should invest most of our money understanding the values of potential stakeholders. So we don't really have a good understanding of that. And I think that can be in terms of gaining information, that can have a really dramatic impact on our conservation success, both in terms of identifying the best priorities, but also in terms of making sure that implementation actually happens. Okay, so I guess that's the framework within which we're thinking of some of this stuff, and it's really about that value of these understanding these social components versus the ecological components. So now I'm going to take a bit of a track back to the social stuff that I was talking about, and I guess we've been using some ideas from social networks, some social network theory, to try to characterize social systems and and try to answer some of these questions in a completely data-free way, and making lots of assumptions, but I think it's a start. So what is social networks? So generally social networks are really a framework for characterizing social or institutional systems. So it's really a structural framework. It's a way of sort of quantifying links between institutions or individuals that allows us to make some inferences about how that system might behave. And so essentially, largely the approach taken is to focus on some characteristics of that network, characteristics of the structure of that network, and then relating that to sort of environmental outcomes or effectiveness, and using, I guess, theory from the social sciences to try to infer what different network structures might imply for the governance or the effectiveness of management of natural resources and also conservation values. So typically, I guess we might be interested in these are small networks, but the structure of the network, but also the sort of the type of ties between individuals. So these might be individuals. We're interested in the structure of that network potentially, but also the type and the strength of those ties between individuals or institutions. So I guess some of the typical measures that are focused on are things like centrality, which really says, well, how central. So this would be a highly centralized network with a central actor or institution that's highly connected to other players in the system. Things like network density, which is really the number of ties or the density of ties, and cohesiveness. So this would be a highly dense. There's a lot of ties in this between individuals, and this would be a non-sort of cohesive network where you've got two subgroups essentially. And then tie strength might be important as well. So I thought I might touch on just quickly each of those things, and I guess we use some of these ideas to actually build in the assumptions of our model, which we try to ask some of these questions about the importance of the social network for conservation planning. So I'll just briefly go through that. So thinking about sort of the density of, essentially the density of ties. So the density of ties may have sort of positive influence on governance. It really provides things like opportunities for collaboration, development of trust, the sharing of information. And I guess the more ties there are, the more greater the ability for information, for instance, and collaboration to spread through the network. So this is sort of a network, a sort of a knowledge network. So this is the sharing of knowledge across a network that Sandstrom built in 2008, and these were looking at the management of inland lakes and watercourses in northern Sweden, and really found that I guess the density of ties was important in terms of the effectiveness of governance of those networks. So I guess some of the theory and evidence would suggest that density can be an important positive aspect on the governance of natural resources and conservation. Centrality also has been is hypothesized to have an important role in governance of social networks, largely because actors having central roles can have disproportionate influence. If those are innovators or are able to introduce new actions for the management of natural resources, and that can have important impacts on the overall functioning of the system and management of those resources. And so I guess some theories of the sort of diffusion of innovation and so on in social sciences suggest that those people might be central in sort of diffusing innovation across the network. And this is again a knowledge transfer network in agroforestry in Ghana, again demonstrating that those central players actually had a very positive influence on those agroforestry management in that system. So interaction strength as well. So I guess we are talking here about the links between actors or institutions. Those interactions can be different types. So there could be knowledge transfer interactions. There may be interactions, sort of social interactions that drive the system. But the strength may be an important driver of the effectiveness of management of those systems, largely through the diffusion of innovation, but also through the generation of social influence. So strong ties, or actors that have strong ties tend to be much more similar than actors that don't have strong ties, suggesting that the behaviour of actors that have very strong ties are likely to be the same or to be similar. So if you have an innovator who's strongly connected to the rest of the network through strong ties, that innovation is much more likely to diffuse across the network, and then the rest of the network to adopt those innovations. So I guess this was an example of sort of PREL used in the Peak District in the UK, really looking at weak ties and strong ties, and found that a lot of the cohesiveness of the network was down to sort of weak ties, and there were fewer strong ties. And so a lot of this, the dynamics of the system driven by weak ties, but these strong ties might be more permanent and be more than the weak ties, which are more really diffuse ties, and potentially has a strong influence on the management of that network, or the governance of that network. I guess so. I guess in general, theory would suggest that strong ties are important for diffusion of innovation and also influence across a network. But strong ties can also have the effect of actually limiting innovation from outside. So if there's very strong ties, the ability to get innovation from outside actually can be reduced. Okay. So I guess there's a bit of background on some of the theory of why things like interaction strength, centrality, and the density and cohesiveness of ties might be important for governance, and I'll use some of that when we set up our model later on. So what about social networks and conservation and prioritisation? I guess there's only a few examples of where social networks have been used in conservation prioritisation. So this is one example where Marina Mills used it in Fiji to basically look at these are values of different reef types, and then these are some measure of centrality score across those reef types. And what the assumption here was that the higher the centrality score and the connectedness of those networks, the more likely it was that successful implementation of conservation action would occur there. And so they're taking some of those ideas from some of the social theories that suggest that strong ties and centrality improve governance to actually apply that in a conservation planning framework. And they actually use this in a conservation prioritisation as one of the objectives. But I guess we currently have little insight about really when it is most critical to have information on these characteristics of these social networks in conservation prioritisation. And we don't really know either to what extent does this depend on some of the characteristics of those social networks versus things like the patterns of biodiversity. Okay, and so that's really what we've been trying to address. Okay, so I guess that's the why we're doing this stuff, and what I'm going to talk about now is really, so we've set up a really simple model to try and test some of these ideas, using some of the social theories that would suggest how people might respond given networks and network strength and network structure, and then try to explore how does the effect of the network depend on both the type of network and the network tie strength, but also the distribution of biodiversity. Okay, so I'm going to set up a really simple model, and as I said, there's no data in this. So this is, I guess, this is sort of commonish. It's a pretty common conservation problem, where, particularly on private land, where we have a number of properties or planning units, and we have institutions or landholders or actors who, let's call them landholders, but this can translate into actors. It could even be administrative units, and basically we have these properties. Let's call them properties and landholders, farmers, and we've got lizards and what's that? I don't know. Butterflies and, I don't know, looks like a wallaby almost, but I'm not sure. We've got species. We've got 3 species here. And we've got 4 properties. And they all have different distributions of species in those properties. But we also have people who are responsible for managing those properties as well. So these are landholders, and these guys are making decisions. Okay? And let's assume they can make 3 different types of decisions. They can either continue their existing land management, and let's assume if they continue their existing land management, these species persist into the future until they do something different, because they're there at the moment. Or they can engage in a long-term conservation agreement. This might be a reserve, it could be a covenant, but let's say they engage in a long-term conservation agreement, and that protects the species forever. Yeah, pretty bold assumption, but let's assume that for now. Or they can develop their land and do something else with it. And let's assume if they develop their land, we lose all the species, and they're gone. Okay. But we're a conservation organisation, and we're trying to make decisions about what we want to engage particular landholders, and we want to know which one to engage in. And we want to convince those landholders to we want to convince those landholders to engage in a long-term conservation agreement of some kind. So our challenge is to identify which one of these to invest in. Where should we spend our time? Who should we go and talk to? And who should we convince that this is the best thing for them to do? But these guys are also talk to each other, and they influence each other. They share knowledge. They share innovations, and so they have these ties. These social. I'll just call them social influence, but they could be transfer of innovation. And so these are ties. Okay. So what this guy does may influence what these guys do. Okay, because they're connected. So what we've done, we've sort of built a model that tries to mimic that situation in a dynamic sense about the decision making, and assume that decisions made by these guys also influence the decisions made by other guys. So essentially, we're assuming taking some ideas from I guess theory of influence, and saying that strong ties, particularly strong ties, are likely to make these behave much more similarly over time. Okay, so we also vary the tie strength, and allow that tie strength, by strong tie strength, to mean it's more likely that they'll behave more similarly than if they have a weak tie strength. Okay, so just to think about the dynamics of the system, to illustrate it, let's start with everything's available, no one's doing anything, they're just managing their land. We're a conservation organisation, and we want to actually engage one of these landholders. So let's say we engage this one. He says, yeah, okay, I'll engage in this conservation agreement. We set up a covenant, we buy his property, whatever. We protect these species. So we get these 3 species. And this might be the most sensible one to do if we ignored the network, because that's the highest species richness. And basically we've represented all species here. However, at the same time, they're making decisions about what they should do. Maybe this guy here, this is in time t+1. Maybe they develop their property. We lose those species, and they're consigned to fossils bones in a museum. Okay. But at the same time, these guys are connected. So this guy might talk to this guy and say, "Hey, this is a good idea. I made lots of money from developing my property. Why don't you do the same?" Okay. So there's an influence across this way. And this guy, next time step, this guy after that, you might be able to influence this guy to do the same. Okay. So we assume that the stronger this tie, the more likely it is that these 2 will influence each other, will behave in a more similar way. But we also do that for the individuals who conserve their property. There's also influence here. So this guy might have set up a covenant on his land. He feels good about it. Talks to his friend and says, this is a great idea. Well, there might be some, you convince them to take up some innovative way of managing their property, and this guy takes up that innovation through that link. And so the next step, we might be able to convince this guy to reserve their property. So essentially, that's the type of model we've set up. And we assume that if we engage a landholder, it's really the probability that they actually engage with us and set up a conservation agreement that depends on the influence of their friends or then people they're tied to who've also got conservation agreements. And the same is true for the development. So there's influence across the network. So I won't spend too long on this, but if anyone's interested in the maths, we have a set of transition probabilities of going from available. This is if we engage a landholder, going to conserve, so some probability. So this is just the probability that they'll reserve it without any influence from their friends. This is the probability that they won't. So they might not reserve it, but then their friends influence them. And it depends. NR is the number they're connected to, who've also reserved their properties. Or they might develop, and again, this depends here on the probability of not reserving, and then the probability of developing or not developing, but with their friends influencing them to actually develop. I'm not going to spend long on that, but if anyone's interested, they can have the slides later. But if we don't engage a landholder, their property is available, the probability of conserving that property is 0, because we're not even engaging them, so we assume they don't just automatically go conserve their property. And then there's some probability of developing, which again depends on how many friends they're connected to who've also developed their properties. So there's really an influence across the network. Okay, so I guess there's 3 key assumptions, and some of this is I guess this is loosely tied on some of the theories that sort of suggested how networks might behave in the real world. But obviously, this is a generalization, and in some ways, every case is different. But I guess our view is that if you can't find generalities in a simple model like this, you're not going to find them in the real world either. So it's a starting point. So I guess there's 3 key assumptions. So actors that share social ties are likely to behave more similarly than actors that do not share social ties. So this is using sort of theory of influence and possibly innovation, I guess. And the greater the number of social ties, the more likely actors will behave in a similar way. So either this might be through social influence, but also through diffusion of innovation that's more likely. So there's, if you have a greater number of ties, so essentially if you've got centralized actors who connect to a lot of people, they're likely to have much more influence in being able to convince people to be more similar than someone who's not a central actor. But we assume there's no heterogeneity among actors. They all behave the same, which is clearly wrong, but it makes the model simpler. But I think we can explore, we haven't done it, but we could explore how heterogeneity changes. So there's sort of ideas about thresholds of adopting innovation where people vary, and people may need more of the network to be adopting a particular practice before they use that innovation. And some people may be sort of early adopters, and those thresholds are lower. So we don't incorporate any of that stuff. So we consider really small networks. I'm going to show you results for 6 node networks, and we're interested in things like whether centrality was important. So we consider simple networks, a star, which has a very central node, a line, which sort of has low centrality, and a ring, which is low centrality. And then we considered a star and a ring joined together, which really has a bridging tie between two clusters of nodes. And we were interested in whether those different types of networks, which really vary in how centralized they are, drive the importance of the network for conservation prioritization. And we also varied the tie strength. So we actually varied the influence of people who develop and reserve, but I'm just going to show you results for where we varied basically the chance that someone who's reserved influences their friends there to also reserve their sites for their properties. And we looked at the tie strength as well to really see whether that was an important driver. And I guess theory would tell us that it probably is. And then we believe before we did this, that the species distribution will also be important. And so we looked at 3 levels of different types of species nestedness. And we looked at species nestedness because generally conservation priorities are driven by the thing that's most variable. And so nestedness essentially of species, so nestedness basically means is essentially a representation of how species are represented through sites. So if the species are very highly nested, it means the most species-rich site contains all the species, and all other sites are subsets of those species. In that case, there's a lot of heterogeneity in that network, because the value of the most species-rich site, if you get that site, that's all you need to represent the species. Once you've got that site, everything else is worthless, because you've already represented all the species. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the value. So we looked at perfectly nested species distributions. So we had sites down here. This is species. So as you can see, each of the sites that are more species poor is a subset of the most species rich. We had some partially nested sites and then some random sites. And these, I guess, these are partially related to the number of endemics as well. So under perfectly nested, there's nothing that's endemic. There's nothing that's just represented by one site. Under randomness, there are a number of endemics. So I don't think in this case there is. No, there isn't. Oh, yes, there is. This site. No, that's not. No, there's no endemics in that. But we do get more endemics in this case. So in this case, under random, essentially the sites are more equal in value on average, whereas they're very unequal in value in this case. So we thought that would also probably be an important contribution. So how did we solve this problem? So we set up our models, and we used stochastic dynamic programming to find the optimal strategy through time. So it is about, we're trying to find, given the state of the system, what is the optimal strategy at any point in time, and so we're thinking about where and when what's the optimal strategy. And we looked at using full information, found the optimal strategy, taking into account information about species distributions and the network. We used only information on species distribution. So this is what typical conservation planning does. It says, we've just got information on species, let's use that. And then we looked at it from a social science point of view and thought about, well, what if we only have information on the network? So we found our optimal solutions. We did some simulations of the dynamics in the decision process, assuming the conservation organisation behaves optimally with the information they have. And then we evaluated that relative to some random engagement to get a baseline. So I'm just going to show you some results. So as I said, there's a few things that we need to sort out with this stuff, but this gives you an idea of the types of results we're getting. So this is what I'm showing here is this is actually the relative conservation benefit of our approach that considers both the network. This is using all information, so it uses the network and information about the network and the species distributions. And this is for randomly distributed species. So we've got some endemic species within this, and so sort of on average the similar value between sites. So and this is showing the relative conservation benefit versus a model where we only consider the species distributions. So this is versus like the typical conservation planning approach where we ignore the social component. And then this is the tie strength. This is the tie strength. This is the influence or the probability that someone who's reserved their property convinces their friends it's a good idea. And then the different lines are the different types of networks. So as you can see, as the tie strength goes up, your conservation benefit goes up, largely because once the tie strength goes up, the network becomes much more important. So the spread of innovation or the spread of influence across the network is much quicker. And so there's a big benefit in being strategic in using that information to get greater conservation gains. What you can also see is the difference between the networks is pretty small. So it's really the strength of the interaction that drives the benefits of accounting for the social network. The star network, we'll see later, the star network tends to be a little bit more influential. But actually, when we have rare species, or this is for rare species, I think the probability of occupancy of a species is about 20% in this case. So this is sort of a typical conservation example. We've got lots of species that are rare. Same plot for 120 species, but once the distribution is nested, highly nested, there's no benefit in incorporating the social network. And this is largely because all you need to do is get that most species-rich site. You don't care about the social network. You just know you need one site. So this is an extreme example, but in this case, and then we also in between, you get an in-between relationship once it's partially nested. Okay, so in this case, basically, the social network seems to matter, especially tie strength, probably partly the structure of the network, but the distribution of species has a really important effect on whether we should care about the network. So this is when we did this for a few species, it's actually different, and I think I'm not quite sure why this is. And so if we looked at 20 species, again, it's the same plot relative to the typical conservation planning approach. Once the tie strength goes up, we actually do worse. And I'm not really quite sure. I don't think we've got to the bottom of why this is. The only difference between this and the other scenario is that there's fewer species. And I think what it is that with few species, you either do really well or you do really badly. So either you get your species, but if you miss out, you do really badly. So you tend to do, basically what it does, it pushes up the variance of your return. So your sort of expected return might be the same. And I think what this does, so this shows the relative standard deviation of the returns. And as tie strength goes up, you basically get more uncertain. So on average, you do potentially do better. But I think what this is doing is, because this is this stochastic variation over time, it's discounting your returns when you're actually incorporating that network. That's why things happen, but we're not sure. And I'm going to talk to Yadin afterwards and see if we can figure it out. So that's a sort of interesting result, and I think maybe there's some interesting results from this in terms of your potential variation. So I think there might be, depending on the network and the social behaviour, there might be implications for the risk that we're taking. So I think, but we're yet to really explore that fully. So now I'm going to show you some quick pictures of the value of considering species. So this is the benefit of considering species only relative to random. So again, this is the typical conservation planning approach. Again, there's not a lot of difference, a huge difference between network types. So this might be because we're just looking at small networks or motifs. But certainly you do worse as the tie strength goes up, so as you would expect. And then if you're a conservation taking into account the network, you do much better as the tie strength goes up. And so I guess one thing we were interested in so this is really the social network, the social science. This is the social scientist. This is the ecologist. And I guess somewhere around the tie strength of about 0.4 is where they cross over, which is really where you would switch from doing one or the other. Okay, so like tie strength around about 0.4 or 0.5, you're better off just one. If you had to choose between either, you're better off just to be the conservation planning with species. If the tie strength is above 0.5, you're better off to worry about the social system. So that changes as you change the parameters of the model, but it's potentially a simple rule of thumb. Okay, so I guess to make that a bit clearer in terms of the diagram I had earlier, which was thinking about if you start from nothing, where would you go first in terms of understanding the social or ecological system? What we're showing here is the relative benefit of going from none to one of them to both. And the blue line is doing species first, we worry about species distributions. The green line is about worrying about the network first. And as you can see, tie strength is 0. This is for randomly distributed species, by the way. Tie strength is 0. Obviously, the network doesn't really exist. We should just worry about the species. And as we increase tie strength, the social network becomes much more important. And that, to a tie strength of about 0.75, the network becomes much more important. This is a really strange result as well, that with the network, just in considering the network, we actually do better than both. I'm not sure why that is, but I think it might be to do with the variance of returns as well, potentially. But the general pattern is that as that tie strength goes up, eventually it becomes much better to go social system first, then worry about the ecological stuff. So this is for highly nested species. In this case, again, it's always the ecological stuff driving it. So it doesn't matter what the network is, doesn't matter what tie strength is. If you really highly nested species distributions, so where you've got really high spatial distribution of conservation value, then it's really the conservation species that really matter. But again, number of species matters, and when you have low numbers of species, again, it seems to be the species distributions that really drive the system. And I think again, this is because if you get it wrong, you miss those species, you really suffer. But you could get a big win. So I think again, it's something to do with the variance of returns. Okay, so I'm going to end there. So I guess there's 4 take-home messages from this stuff. So I guess the key thing, that was of interest to us, and we found quite surprising, not surprising, I guess we predicted it, but I think we were able to show that really the importance of the social network depends not only on the characteristics of the network, but also on the characteristics of the ecological system too. So in this case, the distribution of species. And I'm guessing that might be a general situation where the thing that really drives, the thing that has most heterogeneity, either is it the social system or the ecological system that drives heterogeneity, is the thing you should care about most. So really tie strength and to some extent network centrality really drove the importance of the social network. But it was this species nestedness and possibly endemism that also drives the importance of the social network. And I guess Andrew Knight said a few things about this in terms of the looking at the Cape Touristic region where everything's endemic and each site is the same value. His view is that we shouldn't worry about the ecology, we should just worry about the social system. And I guess this really supports those statements. So I guess we've got a way of integrating the dynamics of social networks into dynamic conservation planning. And I think I think one of the things we'd like to think about is, could you actually ever apply this stuff? Could you so if you knew something about tie strength, you knew something about the social network, could you have come up with some predictions about what we should worry about really in terms of, and then test it? So anyway, we haven't done that, but I'd be interested to hear if anyone has any ideas on how to do that. But I think even if we can't, this tells us a little bit about what we need to know to be able to make that decision, at the very least. And anyway, thanks to Nadine and Angela and Oyan, who I've worked with on this, and the ARC Centre of Excellence, who funded a couple of workshops where some of these ideas came from. So, okay, I'm going to shut up. Questions?
Yeah. I have a question about how you were talking about what we need to, it could possibly tell us about what we need to know.
Yeah.
So, I think some of the results would be really useful from, the perspective of an organisation going into a landscape and they don't really know much about the people, what's going on. And so some of those figures are basically saying that the first thing you really need to know about is how much people talk to each other. Because that's really going to drive whether or not you actually need to learn about the structure of the social network.
Yeah.
So if you don't really know much about anything, first you should probably just do some sort of scoping about how strong are those ties. Because if the ties are below, sort of 0.5 or whatever for most of those distributions, you can say, well, we don't even need to learn about the structure of the network. We just need to know that people sort of talk to each other half the time. So that would actually, and then you would really only bother learning about the structure of the network. You could still say, look, there's a social network here, but you would only learn about the structure of that network once you learn something about those ties. So it's sort of driving research, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I think you sort of need to even use any of this stuff. You've got to have some idea of at least have a broad idea about, are there any connections? But you could do that stepwise. Say, well, you could talk to people, say how much do you talk, and who talks to who as a rough broad.
Sort of don't know what sorts of social surveys to do, because that could actually inform how they structure their social surveys, rather than going and doing this massive social network of their entire landscape when they first go in there. They could spend their resources and expand their expand the area that they can work in, because they don't have to ask as many detailed questions.
Yep, I agree.
Just following on that question, I think I'm really interested in how you define the ties.
Right.
Because it depends on that, and how did you define the string? So is it like a talking tie? Is it economic, managerial? What kind of?
We didn't specify. It could be any of those. And the way we structured it was actually it's just in any time step there's a probability that someone who's develop their property, there's some probability that they'll be able to influence the people they're connected to also do the same. And so the tie strength was a value between 0 and 1, which reflected the probability that they would actually be successful in doing that. So if the probability was 0, they would never be able to influence the people they're tied to do the same as them. And if it was 1, they were 100% certain to be able to do that. And then in between was some variation. And I know that sort of, in some ways we're sort of assuming there's a gradual increase in the ability to as you increase that tie strength, there's a gradual increase. I know there are some theories around that suggest that it's more of a threshold and so on, but we didn't, something we could explore, but we didn't really specify what the tie was. But if you knew what the tie was, you would have a specific case study. You could construct that tie in different ways if you wanted to, depending on how you thought that tie worked and how the influence flowed or how innovation flowed across that link. Yeah, but we were just trying to be as general as possible here. Yeah.
I'm just thinking because towards decision that so the amount of influence, if you're talking about action, so it's like how much do I influence that someone takes action?
Yeah.
So it's like the time boundary is really important.
Right. Yeah.
So if you are talking about conservation timing and then managerial timing,
yes,
they might not go together in the real world.
Yeah.
When you apply this work.
So we could probably deal with that in this. We could assume that there's a time delay, or depending on what the type of tie is. Yeah, I think we could deal with that. That's possible. Yep.
I guess two related questions I'm following on from what you said there. Centrality, I mean, so there's studies by Tom Brewer and others that show that centrality with relation to the market leads to exploitation of marine resources because it's easy to get them to the market. And so I guess in terms of these networks, something to think about, and I think might be interesting to do conceptually, is that there's going to be a lot of different actors trying to influence these social networks, conservation being one of them. Yeah. And depending on your context, so in Melanesia it might be drivers of seafood demand in China. Yeah. And they are going to be trying to influence these systems as well. And the more central someone is, the more likely they are to change and just fish out their local reef and settle the fish.
That's right. So we sort of have that in a way in this because we have influence through the development area, but we see the networks are the same. So actually the network can be bad because if the developer's network is the tie strength is very high, actually you do worse as the network tie strength goes up because it's a sort of a similar analogous thing to what you're saying. So it's like an exploitation network. Yeah.
And I guess my next point was just, I'm sure and possibly you looked at this already, the people in business research, marketing research, got all sorts of nuanced ways of measuring this because it's exactly how you target marketing of your product.
Yeah, I haven't really looked at that, but it's a good idea. We should, I think. Yeah.
Well, the first point really depends, exploitation or not, really depends on the land tenure system.
As well,
Because if the state owns the land or if it's one private, like a group of private owners and there is no community bounds, I think it is quite more likely that has been proved. If there is a strong management, so centrality is not centrality directly linked to outside, but centrality as an association or that tighten the bonds between the community. It has been shown that with secure antenna, it has been shown that has a positive impact. In fact, your model confirms mathematically what has been shown on the ground, and that's pretty awesome. I found that people organize as a community within an assembly that centralized and tighten the bonds just lead to more likely to have better outputs with ecosystems that are rich in species.
But I guess that would be nice to include in the model and would be interesting for a range of issues. Marine resources, wildlife trade would be tenure, effective tenure. So where it's effectively open access like it is in Melanesia, yes, centrality to the market boom, it goes. Elephants in many parts of Africa, whereas on private land, enforced, market, the people on that land have an incentive to look after the resource in the long term, so it's not just going to disappear quickly.
You can actually test the model on some systems.
We could.
There are plenty of forests, in fishery, etc. They have a lot of social network analysis and biodiversity.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think 10 years is a good idea actually. And I think, I have to think about how we do that. Yeah, because we've assumed it's private land really. Yeah. Essentially.
Which was outside of countries like Australia often functionally as effectively.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Okay.
Kind of two questions. One of them was, in a real system, how do you measure tie strength? Because I might talk to my neighbor a lot, but I might think they're an idiot, so I'll never listen to what they're doing, and someone else that I rarely talk to, I might follow what they're doing a lot. So.
That's right. I guess it's sort of used by things like number of interactions and those types of things, but I don't know. There are other ways that, Angela, have you got some other ways? That, I mean, that sort of seems to be, it's the number of interaction type of things, isn't it? Or the type of interaction can...
People share in ways of frequency is one of them, frequency of interaction. But also, some of the questions they use is in terms of what they think is that contribution or that collaboration is providing. For example, it's a collaboration. How is that collaboration beneficial to the problem?
The type of interaction could be the networks could be quite different. So you could have, some landholder who never interacts with people really, but is sort of well respected in the community, and they're very influential, even though they don't actually physically interact, but they've got some influence across that.
And also longevity as well, and whether it's
right. Yep.
Whether it's a relationship.
In communities, you've got also shareholding. If you've got shareholding and plus an assembly, the ties are strong.
Right.
Individually, shareholding is there.
And then the other question I had was, you showed there's big differences between few species and a lot of species. Yeah. Have you tried varying the size of the social network to see where that...
Yeah, we have. We've gone up to 10, but it just takes forever to solve it. You can only solve it for small networks, really. And I'm trying to get some results for 10. But we're just trying to make sure we understand the 6 first, and then. So I have run it for 10, and you sort of get the same sort of pattern. But I think with 10, the relationships are stronger with the larger network, I think, from memory. Yeah, so it's actually, the patterns are stronger with a larger network, but I think 10 is probably as high as we can go. So it's a really small network, so it's,
Again, that's why I think the link to the marketing business literature would be really interesting. I mean, I don't read that literature, just read financial pages, and they talk about companies that identify a network, the key individuals that are influential in that network, how to influence them so that you get 100 people buying your product by convincing one person to buy it.
That's right.
And so I guess you could do that conceptually quite simply as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you should have a look at that stuff. It's sort of, with the centralized network, it's a bit like that here, because when you're trying to find the optimal strategy, you're actually, when you ignore the species distributions, you just base decisions on the social network. You just always go for the central guy.
Right.
So you're trying to, as long as you can identify that central guy, that's what you do best, because that's how you influence the rest of the network.
And I guess that then comes back to the question of how do you measure that tie?
Yeah.
It could be someone who sees everyone every day, but doesn't
that's right.
have much influence.
Yeah. So I think you'd have to be careful about how you measure that tie, depending on what sort of network it is you're thinking of as well. So the type of network and how you measure it's really critical.
A lot of the questions for influence is in terms of who do you seek for advice, or making
decisions,
which is really outlined.
Yep.
So presumably you can tackle that in the types of questions you ask. Really? Yeah.
Just last question. I think I agree with this discussion about the strength of the ties, but I think what Jonathan also showed is that is only important for if you were to look at your decision tree, what information is important. That's just a special case where species distribution is, this way. And so I think that's what could be interesting too, is just have some kind of decision tree. When is it worth investigating that? Just clear, like this. I think that's what everybody's feedback. but your feedback very well that part. But just a decision tree. When is it worth investigating? And then we can ask the question. Okay, so we're in a situation where the social network and the ties are important. But they also need to be above a certain threshold. So your probability of success when you try to influence someone needs to be above 50%.
Yeah.
So then you can work on that specific problem.
Yeah.
So you made 3 assumptions about heterogeneity, number of ties, and similarity.
Yeah, tie strength.
What's your bet if you relax the 3 assumptions? I'll just
That's a tough question.
After doing this massive job, just now, do you have a better feeling about that?
So
If you relax the assumptions.
I mean, heterogeneity.
Heterogeneity in the actors.
I mean, heterogeneity is going to make the rules a bit more difficult to distinguish, I'd say. Probably. Depends. I mean, yeah. And what the other ones were really
the key is the first assumption. The one that's really based on first one.
Actors that share social ties are likely to be more similar.
Similar, that's right. Yeah.
You relax that.
That's right.
Yeah. But it's a pretty strong, it's a pretty good one.
I think it's quite well. It just seems to be quite well established in the literature. I think that people who have strong ties are similar. Yeah. So we can sort of justify it, but you're right. It relies entirely on. You're right. It relies entirely on that assumption.
Basically, we are socially basically saying we're social individuals. When we make decisions based on others, not on just us and what we think or what we see the information in front of us. We really get influenced in terms of making decisions. So that has been proven over and over again in terms of social psychology.
Yeah.
If they are neighbors or within the same community, if they are not in the same, if they are not neighbors, not necessarily, right?
Not neighbors, or if you don't talk to them, if they're not part of your social group, who really influence your decisions is whoever you're connected, whoever you use. Or even if you're like in a meeting, when you stay in a meeting, you'll be very well influenced by who's there.
That is.
Yeah. And then the second assumption was the one about the number of ties, and as the number of ties goes up, you're more likely to be influenced. And I guess there's some empirical support for that, but I think the relationship is uncertain. So there could be a threshold, for instance. So you don't become well. There's an innovation that you pick up. You might not do that until you've got 80% of your friends have done it as well. Then there may be some threshold. Whereas we didn't assume that. We assume there's sort of it's not quite linear, but it's a gradual increase in the chance.
And it also depends on attributes, like attribute of a particular actor. So you might, in some instances, it might be someone who's really trusted or really respected. So even if you connect to that one actor, it actually might drive influence a lot, and then if you connect to 10 or 20 people who are not that well.
Yeah, right.
So I think in that one, maybe things will change.
That's right. And that sort of comes back to that heterogeneity idea. I guess there might be heterogeneity. Some people are respected, some aren't. Yeah.
I think an interesting question for after extension would be to link with an antenna.
Yeah.
And how changing the antenna and security will change the ties and the 3 assumptions. And that's I think, an interesting pitch. But heterogeneity of actors, I think, is like they start to understand that heterogeneity could be bad or could be better for providing different options.
That's right.
For different species. And
it depends on where those there's different types of actors and where they occur in the network could be quite crucial.
Yeah, and especially for systems where you've got an economy based on extraction of species. You've got different market channels and supply chains for different species, and that's a lot of countries, especially in developing countries, they are asked to diversify the local economy.
Yep.
And you've got diversity of factors. If you don't have this diversity of factors, they don't expect sustainability for the system.
Yeah.
So I think it would be interesting also to see that. So non-tenure and diversity of factors. I don't know.
That can be the next. That can be the next 2 papers.
We can follow up this
That's right.
discussion over
Yeah.
some year.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Let's pull this out.
Thank you very
All right.